Okay, so I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker today, Jay Dolmage. Jay is an associate professor of English at the University of Waterloo and an editor of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. Jay is committed to disability rights through his scholarship, service, and teaching. His work brings together rhetoric, writing, disability studies, and critical pedagogy. His books include Disability Rhetoric, published in 2014, followed by Academic Ableism, Disability in Higher Education in 2017, which is open access and available online. And in 2018, he published Disabled Upon Arrival, Eugenics, Immigration, and the Construction of Race and Disability. For our talk today, we asked the audience to hold their questions until the end, as we'll have some question period at the end. And with that said, I'd like to introduce Jay to the stage for his talk today entitled Academic Ableism and Open Accessibility.
Hello, good morning. I just want to reiterate that you should use the space in whatever ways you want to. I also would say that with the note cards and the pens on the table, that can be a way to ask questions if you're not comfortable putting your hand up. So, if there are things that pop up as I'm speaking, you can write those questions down and we'll make sure and collect them. There are large print and regular size copies of my talk and of my slides, and they're at the back, but if you need one of those, maybe you can let us know and we'll get it to you. The other thing that I'll say is there's a website. I just created a website for this talk. It's www.accessibalitysymposium.wordpress.com. And if you go there, you'll see that you can get a digital version of the talk or the slides. But also a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about or link to, those links are here. So another reason for this is that you can maybe share it. There might be people who couldn't make it today. Or you can just relax while I'm talking and not feel like you need to take notes or anything like that, because you know you can go back and get those things. And I always say most of the time my goal when I give a talk is to highlight the much more interesting work of other people. So I try to link to those things so that hopefully that brings you to those things as well. So I want to thank you for the territorial acknowledgement as well. My talk's going to be a kind of map, so I'm hoping we can engage with a sense of that, of space and our responsibility to space as part of what we do today. So I'm just going to go to my slides from here. All right, so I have three metaphors or a kind of legend for my talk. All right, steep steps, the retrofit, and universal design. These things are going to be familiar to all of you, and I think I'm probably making arguments that a lot of people in the room are already on board with, but I'm hoping that in framing them this way, this is a kind of way that you can all go out and frame these things as you make arguments for the accessibility that I know that you all are arguing for and working towards. This will just take 1 second. So I'm going to be the first image that I'm going to be showing you is from Ryerson University. And it's some steep steps in their new student center. Are many of you members of the AODA Alliance? A few. If you're not, you should join their mailing list. Their advocacy efforts are really crucial to a lot of the work that we're doing, and through their mailing list you can often find great ways to support the work that they're doing. They do things like, for instance, create form letters that you can send to your MPP, or things like that I think most of us would find really useful. Okay. So this is our first image, and what we see is a set of concrete steps. This is in the new Ryerson student building. On either side of the stairs there are railings, and the steps sort of narrow upwards. There are also 3 railings down the middle of the set of stairs, but the salient feature here, and the individual we see in the picture is David Leposki, who is the chair of the AODA Alliance. This is from a YouTube video that he created of a kind of walkthrough of this new space to kind of highlight the ways that it's inaccessible, even as a brand new student space. There's a giant column right up in the middle of this set of stairs, and you're sort of invited to follow one of these railings, but it would take you right into this column. There's no railing around the column except for on the far side of the column, so maybe if you got lost somewhere in the middle of the stairs, you might find that other railing. But this is the first metaphor that we're working with, okay? And that is the steep steps. And this could be at Ryerson. This is definitely at York. It's definitely on my own campus at Waterloo. University campuses are lousy with stairs. And I think that this works a lot more as a lot more than just an architectural feature. It's an ideological, it's an aesthetic, it's a pedagogical feature of university campuses. So even, and the scary part is that even these new student spaces that are sort of billed as creating a cultural student experience, like this Ryerson space, they're also inaccessible. So one of the other features of this new Ryerson space is what they call hangout steps. So they're big, giant sets of stairs that are not only not designed for accessibility, but they're designed to be hung out on. The 53rd Avenue Library in New York City has a similar new feature. This is becoming a fad. So it's steep steps all over again, and it creates this other further layer of inaccessibility, not just because it's difficult to traverse the steps, but because that's where students are supposed to be hanging out. That's where social time is supposed to be structured. And it's really disappointing that that metaphor for that space is, again, stairs. So the second metaphor is a retrofit. What you see here is a ad hoc blue ramp that's been put up in front of a deli and pantry on Roncesvalles Avenue in Toronto, and the deli and pantry is called Stasis Preserves. And we see all the items in the window, and this ramp is put over top of half of a set of stairs. There's no railing on the ramp. It looks like it's foldable, so you can take it away, use it if you want to or not. But it also leads up to the sign for the building. So I use this as an example of the retrofit because it shows that when we have solutions for all of the steep stairs around us, they're often unacceptable solutions, right? They add a layer of danger, or they add a layer of delay, and they send the message that this space was not designed for a broad range of bodies. And that if you want to access this space, it's okay that you should have to come around the back, through the kitchen, use a freight elevator. All of these ways that we get our buildings up to spec as per the AODA or other legislation, they send the message that disability is a back door or a side door identity and concern. Okay, so I think we can find these kind of ramps all over the place. One activity that I think we could hypothetically think about would be for a single day, moving across our campus using only accessible entrances. So you can't open any doors that don't have a button. Not allowed to use any stairs. You can only use elevators and ramps. And just to think about how much more effort that would require within your day. I also think that what we see outside the window here, lots of snow, it's such a litmus test for the true intentions of a campus. The last things that are shoveled and cleared and safe are those accessible pathways. And the narrowest pathway is the thing that gets cleared first. And that's the pathway that's demanded of most bodies. So I do think this is I don't know if people are familiar with the Family Circus cartoon where you can see all the footprints and you see where the kids have gone throughout the day, at the end of the day. You can imagine what that would be like to map the ways you'd have to utilize all of those accessible pathways across the campus and how much more effort that takes. So the affect theorist named Lauren Berlant wrote about this concept that certain bodies are marked out for wearing out. And that's something that happens with disability on university campuses. Similarly, in the digital realm, try using your computer to access library or university web pages for a day, but you're not allowed to use your mouse, and see how much work you would get done. The metaphor is similar, right? The retrofits that we have, whether those are keyboard shortcuts, right, or whatever, they're backdoor and side door concerns. And they're less important than things that we think are aesthetic concerns. And so the message that gets sent is that this doesn't come in through the front door. Okay, so I have a 3 little pigs, 3 bears type argument today. Oh, that's really rendered strangely. I have another version of it. It's also still rendered strangely. Okay, well, this is the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. And it's this kind of like sweeping circular structure. There are these kind of bands of glass and steel that kind of swoop up towards a peak at the top of the structure. But what we see at the bottom is that there is a ramp that leads into the building. The main entrance to the building is a ramp. Instead of building the steep steps, it's a ramp into the building to a level entrance. This is an overhead view of crisscrossing ramps within the space itself. And they're made with this fancy stone, and if you go on the website, you see that the stone itself is part of the message. The architect wants it to feel like veins coursing through the space. But the aesthetic argument the space has to make matches with the accessibility. So the feature that makes it accessible is also the argument that the building wants to make, as opposed to a ramp around the back of the building, which makes the argument that disability is not welcome. So this is an example of how you might design a space from the beginning, thinking of the broadest possible range of bodies and minds that might access that space. And that, in a nutshell, is universal design. The interesting thing about universal design is not that it's become a kind of set of guidelines or boxes to tick, but it's that verb design. It's that space is a negotiation, that all of the spaces that we inhabit are in process, and that they can be changed, and that they need to be responsive to the bodies that move through them. So we often hear the excuse that, oh, I work in an old library, or it's a historic building, and it's already built. But spaces are not built, they're building. They're constantly under a process of negotiation. And so universal design helps us to see that. Okay. This is the quote from the Canadian Museum of Human Rights website about universal design. Quote, universal design is not a design style, but an orientation design based on the following premises. Disability is not a special condition of a few. Disability is ordinary and affects most of us for some part of our lives. If a design works well for people with disabilities, it works better for everyone. And usability and aesthetics are mutually compatible. So this is a kind of bad joke. I'm already going to tell you it's a bad joke. But one way to think about this is to say, like, within this room, there's a group of people who don't need to be here, who don't need to hear any of this. And that is people who aren't disabled and people who will never be disabled at any point in their lives. But the joke is that's nobody, right? The truth is disability is something that we will all experience. It's a continuum throughout our lives. And the experience of disability, because it's stigmatized, has been negative. It does not need to be as negative as it is. And in fact, we should all be invested in making that experience of disability, constructing that experience of disability as much less negative than it is, because we all have a personal stake in this. There's a saying within the disability rights community that if you're not disabled now, someday you will be, but people find that to be a kind of threat, right? But that speaks to the stigma around disability. So even just that affect, that feeling when you hear somebody say that of dread is part of the issue. Okay, so I want to go into these metaphors a little bit more, and I'll leave the images up. This is, again, the steep steps image. So I think that the steep steps are more than just a physical feature of campuses. They're an ideological feature. We have a sense that universities are supposed to sort people and step people, right? Whether those steps are built on a kind of set of standards or rigor, right? But we also know that universities step access to the scholarly conversation, access to information, access to knowledge. So I want you to all just think for 1 second. One way we can do this is you could draw a picture of a set of steps. I'll show you how I would do it. So you can draw them like that, and I'm showing a 2-dimensional set of steps that just go up and to the side, all right? Or you can be really artistic, like, because I'm super artistic. I'm kidding. And you could do like the three-dimensional version, like with a horizon point, right? And these are the steps. But what I want you to think about for just a minute is, if this was a kind of graph, or where am I? With an x and a y axis, what are the forces that we see pushing up this set of stairs? What are the forces we've experienced as pushing down? How can we think about the fact that students, for instance, start on different steps? That there are thresholds sometimes for how far we can go. That even when we have ascended these steps, the fact that we've ascended them might create a situation where people are invested in retaining those same forces because they're the ones that help them get up the steps. Okay, so just think about that for 1 second. You can sketch it if you want to. You can even discuss it with the people at your table. All right, just a couple minutes. Okay, we'll finish our conversations. We're going to get to come back to this as I move through my metaphors or different, gradations of porridge or style of house building. So a couple more things to say about the steep steps, just to put this into concrete terms. So anywhere from 6 to 9% of undergraduate students report having a disability, and 35% of these are learning disabilities. We also should assume that many students with invisible disabilities pass, hiding their disability or attempting to overcome it. We also know that the university sorts bodies very effectively by the basis of disability, as much now as it ever has. 27% of Canadians have university degrees, but only 17% of Canadians with mild or moderate disabilities have degrees. Nearly 2/3 of disabled students are unable to complete their degrees within 6 years. Let me say that again. So 2/3 cannot complete their degrees within 6 years. And that gets at that metaphor of the time and the being marked out for wearing out, right? The amount of effort that it takes extends that time. So then the other big piece of this is that these students graduate with up to 60% more student debt by the time they graduate. And this, of course, is only going to be exacerbated as some of the changes we see come down, right? The other thing to say about this is that that only accounts for the students who go through the Office of Disability Services, and I want to talk about that a little bit. Despite the fact that 1 in 7 Canadians has a disability, only 2% of Canadian students actually seek disability accommodations. Unbelievably, 8% of Canadian college or universities reported having no students with disabilities at all, which is impossible, right? So I think that's a really important thing to pay attention to. If you read the Globe and Mail or popular media or Twitter, you would believe that there is an epidemic of students with disabilities all asking for a free handout. And that is absolutely not the case. I was in a department meeting just the other week and had a colleague spout that exact same line, right? It is part of the lore of Ontario University faculty, right? There are all these disabled students and they're all wanting unfair advantages. It's just not true. The other thing to say is that the offices of disability services in North America, their average operating budget is $250,000. That gets you a dean. So our universities are just like freckled with deans, right? And there's only more of those. But many deans make as much as the entire operating budget of these offices. Recent data suggests that the workload per full-time staff member is 1 to 250, and I think that sounds great because I think it's much closer to 1 to 1,000. That's the caseload, right, per individual, per full-time individual, and we know that those numbers are not going to get better over the next 3-4 years as university budgets start to close up. All right, so the other really important thing to say is that in North America, 94% of young people with learning disabilities in K-12, they have accommodations. 94% of them. If you have a diagnosed learning disability, 94% of those individuals will get an accommodation in K-12. 17% of those same students, when they go to university, will get an accommodation. So the very thing that allowed them to graduate from high school, that helped them to get into university, those same types of accommodations, they don't go and get them at university. So there's something really wrong. We know that university is a much more disabling environment for those students with those types of disabilities. So what is going on that's forcing them to do this? We also know that students who do seek accommodations, they wait. They come to get those accommodations in their 3rd or 4th year or once they've reached a point of crisis. And by that point, things are difficult. So what is it about the culture on university campuses that tells people that even though you had accommodations to get here, you should hide your disability when you do get here? Okay? The other piece to connect here with this audience and this group is that most of the scholarly conversation in academia is not at all accessible. Right? That includes an awful lot of what we might call open access. Just as one means of illustrating this, in 2007, Thompson et al., using fairly robust criteria, tested a huge sample of government and education websites in the US and Canada. 45% of these pages, only 45%, even use text equivalents to describe visual elements and images. Only 50% followed HTML standards, and only 24% passed basic navigational criteria. So the research is a bit old now, but I don't know that things are getting better. So again, I urge you to think about this space and what it takes to move through it as an analog to the digital spaces that accompany university campuses. All right, so what are we supposed to do? Most of the time, the solutions that we have are retrofits. So for a student who needs accommodations, they go to the Office of Disability Services and they play a game. I have a couple of game metaphors for what it's like for students to navigate this process. The first thing I'd say is that it's like Las Vegas. What happens for one student in one class stays with that student in that one class. It's part of the culture. It means that, for instance, on my campus, students need to have a new diagnosis every year. They need to negotiate accommodations over and over again from one class to the other. And the message to teachers is that disability is like the game whack-a-mole. When you have a disabled student and you get that email or that letter in your mailbox, you smack it with an accommodation and you continue teaching as usual. Right? So what happens for that one student in that one class, you don't take it forward. You're not encouraged to change your teaching as you move forward. You're encouraged to make a temporary accommodation. It's like that ramp in front of stasis preserves, and I'll show it again. Right? It can fold up and go away when there are no disabled bodies. Right? And it's not a change to the space that's permanent. The other thing, the other game metaphor that I would use is the game Battleship. So have people played the game Battleship? There's a screen, and you throw like a missile or a bomb over the screen, and you hope that you land on a ship on the other side. Well, that's very much what the experience is like for students walking into an Office of Accessibility Services. They're throwing a diagnosis over or a range of accommodations over, and they're hoping that it lands on something on the other side that will help them. But 90% of the accommodations that happen are extended time on tests and exams. I don't give any tests and exams in my classes. There are a lot of classes where that doesn't happen. The second most common accommodation is notes on lectures, right? Alternative formats for lectures. I don't lecture. I do a ton of collaborative and group work in my classes. And I think there are a lot of people in this boat, and for those people, the accommodations that they're given, they're not just retrofits. They're like, remember when Volkswagen got in trouble for defeat devices? They're defeat devices. They make it seem like you're doing something, but you're not changing anything at all. You're not thinking about an expanded range or repertoire of accommodations for the things that you actually do in your classroom. You're just taking those accommodations, applying them to nothing, and no change happens. So that's, unfortunately, the situation in many ways. So the other piece of this is thinking about what it takes to retrofit access to, for instance, proprietary journals that come from Routledge or Taylor and Francis. And I think that process, right, have people heard of the academic VIP process? So one of the ways to get alternative formats of journal articles from these huge proprietary publishers who control so much of the publishing industry is to become what's called euphemistically an academic VIP, right? To do so, you need to disclose the disability, or faculty members are actually encouraged to do this for students. So the faculty member would disclose the disability and seek this academic VIP status, where they have to provide some verification of the disability. That's the way that they would get an alternative format of the article. And again, it's a backdoor process, and it's a process that does not take somebody's privacy or self-advocacy into account. There's also no sense that I can see from this, for faculty themselves, staff or faculty, to have this access, right? It's seen as just something that's for a small group of students. Okay. So, with all this said, I think the ramps are necessary and the elevators are necessary, and we need to continue working through these processes. But I think we can be a lot more creative about what the solutions are. And we can try to be thinking from the beginning about what the cost is to students who are constantly having to go in the back and the side door. So again, you have your ramp metaphor, but I would encourage you in your groups just to discuss for a second, what are some of the accommodations that you've asked for yourself or that you've seen given to students that have worked? And how could we take some of those accommodations that you've seen that work and apply them from the beginning to change how we teach? I talked about the fact that a lot of people on those steps, the people who find themselves at the top of the steps, they're the people who are least likely to question the construction of the steps because it's a system that's privileged them. Well, we know that there's a negative attitude on campus around accommodations. Even among the students themselves who get the accommodations, their perception of them is that they're an unfair advantage. We also know those least likely to grant accommodations are tenured white male professors. So there's a system already in place. Those most likely to grant accommodations are female untenured and sessional faculty. So the very people who have the least institutional power are the people who do create the most change. So how could we take that environment, that system, and knowing that if we reverse the Las Vegas metaphor and take some of the accommodations that work for students and foreground them, how can we use this retrofitting process to circumvent the stairs? So just take a couple of minutes in your groups to chat about that. Okay, if you could just finish your conversations. I know I'm not giving you much time to talk, but I feel like it's worth it because some of this stuff I want to make sure that you guys are getting the chance to apply it to exactly the context that you want to be applying it to. It's also kind of universal design, right? And that's my third metaphor. So universal design of teaching is something that's borrowed from architecture and through the disability rights movement. And it's this idea that we can design pedagogy, that we can design teaching from the beginning with a much broader idea or conception of who's in the classroom. And when we start to do that, we create a classroom that's better for all of the students in the classroom. So that means multiple means of delivering content, so that I'm not using myself as a perfect example, but that I would give my talk, that I would have large print copies, electronic copies, that if I'm having a discussion in class, I would allow that to happen on the message board as well. I've often found, and I'm old enough to have taught at the very beginning of using message boards, but learned big lessons once I started doing that about who had a lot to say in the classroom. And that really advanced the community of learning that I could create in the classroom, not just relying on the students who are going to put their hands up every single day in class, but extending that to other people. So that's the second, but that would be multiple modes of engagement, right? So we have multiple modes of conveying information, multiple modes of engagement, and importantly, multiple modes of showing what you know, right? Assessment. That's really important to me, and I have a soapbox issue here, and that is the amount of time that we spend accommodating to tests and exams. There is no good educational data that shows that timed tests or exams lead to better learning outcomes. And yet they're on my own campus at Waterloo, they are the culture on campus. It's not video gaming or, the student pub. It's tests. And you feel it at midterms, walking around campus. You feel it during finals. It is the acculturation process of the University of Waterloo, timed tests and exams, and how to study for those. And no educational research shows that you learn more. Not through the threat of these tests and the stress, right? Not through the tests themselves. And I strongly believe instead of the 90% of the time that offices of accessibility services have to spend 90% of their resources on testing, professors should have to justify their use of tests and exams every single time they want to use them. And the only good research, the only thing that research shows that these tests and exams are good for is reinforcing racist and sexist hierarchies that already exist. So if you're invested in reinforcing class and race and sexual hierarchies that are already problematic, then good, keep giving tests and exams, because that's what those will reinforce. That's the only thing the research shows they'll reinforce. I told you I had a soapbox issue. But it's just a huge waste of resources around this thing that's not good for teaching or learning. And it's really frustrating. So that's universal design is this idea that you would not have just that modality. That you would have other ways for people to show what they know, what they've learned. And other ways for them to prepare, right, to put those things together and to reflect on what they've learned. So that's universal design. The other piece that I'll say, because I asked you to think about accommodations and how we move these forward, within the disability rights movement, there's this idea of what's called the electronic curb cut effect. Have people heard of this before? It's this idea that, a curb cut on a sidewalk, it is good for wheelchairs, it's good for strollers, it's good for people who don't like tripping and falling. It's just good. It's the proper sidewalk design, right? And we don't build sidewalks without curb cuts anymore, right? I remember when we used to keep building sidewalks with curb cuts, but that seems to have changed, right? The electronic curb cut idea, how many of you have a smartphone with you today? So the electronic curb cut concept basically says everything cool that your phone does was originally a niche technology that was developed for somebody with a disability. It was originally really expensive to do. It was originally something that was extended to those people only when they could verify proof and prove their disability. But even email was something that was first invented for a blind woman. All right? Optical character recognition, speech to text, text to speech, geolocation, all of these things that your phone now takes and turns into apps that allow you to do a million different things. All of those things were originally things that were done and seen as special, right, for a particular group of disabled people. So that's the idea in the classroom as well. That should be the idea in terms of what we're doing to make research and educational resources accessible. This will have outcomes that move far beyond what we think they are. They're not just ramps around the back, right? They're curb cuts that will allow for access for other people in ways that we cannot fully foresee, right? So take optical character recognition, for example. That's a technology that allows us to take a print text and turn it into a searchable document. The digital humanities as a field would not exist if we hadn't started using optical character recognition to make these texts available for other people. A huge amount of what is the value right now of Google comes from something that was done for visually impaired people, right? So it's not a small thing. These changes become very, very big things. Okay, so in the time that I have left, I want to talk a little bit about the fact, a little bit about the overlap between the values of open access, right, which remove financial barriers to information, and the ways that that has not meshed up with the desire to make things more accessible. In fact, I think that we've had a kind of clash of values in the way that that happens. And unfortunately, Routledge and Taylor and Francis, they need to make accessible versions of their text because they'll get sued. The folks who are putting together open educational resources, people who are running journals like I am that are open access, I'll tell you who the staff is of my journal. Me. Right? My journal is highly accessible. To create accessible PDFs, I rely on a kind of pro bono relationship with Accessible IT. They render the PDFs in the most highly accessible way possible. For me to do that, it would be a week of all-nighters every month, right? So a lot, but that's what is happening in the sphere for most of the open access materials is that they are not accessible. The PDFs are not accessible, the HTML is not accessible, and because this is seen as this virtuous thing to create open access materials, those people aren't being called on the fact that these things could and should be universally designed from the beginning, and that it just takes a little bit further action and resources for that to happen, right? I talked about universal design as being about design. Well, the buildings that we're in when they're inaccessible, it's really difficult to argue for them to be torn down, right? It's very difficult for us to argue for them to even be retrofitted properly. But the digital world that we create around education, that's easy to retrofit and fix. That's easy because we're constantly rebuilding it. That's easy because it's not difficult to teach a bunch of computer scientists and system engineers and software engineers how to code accessibly. But we're not doing it. On my own campus, I do get one research assistant who helps me to code HTML accessibly. It's really difficult. University of Waterloo Computer Science is probably one of the best computer science programs in the world. They do not teach W3. They do not teach accessible HTML design. That's something that students do as a hobby if they want something extra on their CV. So it's actually really difficult for me to get an RA. The neat thing is when I get that RA and they come in and they see and they do this work, they're hugely marketable. That RA has an experience, that student has an experience that will get them work for the rest of their lives. And it's easy enough to make that change, but we're not doing it. So I have a couple of guidelines for ways that I think we should be thinking about accessibility in our digital architecture. These are my three guidelines. And I'm matching these with W3. People are familiar with W3, as a kind of global standard for accessibility. So here are my 3 suggestions. I think we should give bodies the same attention we give to algorithms. That's point 1. I'll just go back to my... All right, and what I mean by that is the W3 guidelines for accessibility argue that, quote, in addition to helping assistive technologies, natural language markups allow search engines to find keywords and identify documents in a desired language. So I think that many developers know that natural language markup helps them get search hits, but they don't necessarily understand its other accessibility virtues. Algorithms don't really care about accessibility. But we already cater so much of our writing to their specialized literacy, the literacy of algorithms, a literacy with a lot of unique proclivities and preferences. If we'd add alt text to an image to make it more searchable, then why wouldn't we add alt text to other accessibility features to a text so that once it is found, all possible users can fully access it? So that's the first piece. If we cared as much about the bodies that are accessing text as we cared about algorithms and the searchability of our text, then a lot of these accessibility features would be built in. So I can give you sort of one example. Did anybody do the Facebook challenge, the 10-year challenge? It's this challenge on Facebook to take a picture of yourself 10 years ago and a picture of yourself now to see how you've aged. As you can probably guess, it was actually a data mining exercise, right? It's going to give Facebook a huge amount of knowledge that they can turn into AI to do recognition of faces, right? It would be really interesting to similarly mine the descriptions of those changes, right? Because you could develop a really interesting program that would pre-populate descriptions of people's features, right, with some suggested criteria. How do people describe how they look? Right? So again, this is they know that algorithm that's going to be able to recognize people's faces, especially as they age, is going to be really valuable to them, but so too would that information about how we describe those images and the kind of alt text we'd use. And that's an example of giving bodies the same attention we give to algorithms. The other thing that I would say is that equivalency does not equal equity. So in the ways that we, for instance, describe images or caption videos, it's not enough to just have a verbatim word-for-word translation of what's being said. Right? There's a terrific book that I encourage people to look at by Sean Zdenek, and it's called Reading Sounds. And what it looks at is all of the rhetorical value of an entire soundtrack, not just of what's said. So it can be really frustrating when you're watching a show when the captioning is off, but that captioning is most of the time it's generated by an algorithm. And it's not taking into account, for instance, what the soundtrack is. This came into really sharp focus for me in my graduate class in the fall. I teach a class on the rhetoric of eugenics, and we watched a film called A Quiet Place. Have people seen A Quiet Place? The interesting plot point of A Quiet Place, and I'm not giving anything away, is that you can't make a sound. So the family that is most suited to survive in this world is the family with a deaf daughter, because this family knows ASL. They don't need to make a sound to communicate. They can tell one another how to, stay alive because they're not making a sound. But putting on the captioning for this movie was incredibly frustrating, because for most of the movie, there's nothing. And this movie is powerfully about sound. Even to know that there's a background of cicadas and nothing else is so much a part of what makes the film creepy and interesting, and yet that stuff is stripped away. So that gets at that point, and you can think about how this works in other contexts, that equivalency does not equal equity. So, for instance, in doing markup around figures and charts and graphs, scientists need to think about what are the rhetorical choices they've made in putting those together. They're not just renderings of data. They have rhetorical intentions, right? The way we put together and caption things like infographics, which are hugely rhetorical. They take data and they turn it into something much different, right? But we act as though in giving the equivalency, just giving the range of numbers or access to the chart, that's conveying what those things are supposed to convey, and it's not. So that's the other rule I think we need to take into account, is that you don't get equity of access to information just by giving an equivalency. All right, the third piece is that already all texts are translations of translations waiting to be translated. So how we write text to be translated into other languages, into other code, that really matters. And for that, what I advocate for is plain language. From the disability rights community, there's this movement around reducing academic jargon so that people can have access to the arguments that we're making. So my book, Academic Ableism, as much as was possible, it's an academic book that I tried to write in plain language. This has virtues beyond just expanding the audience, right? It makes a digital text much more easily translatable into different languages. So that access around language can also be access around intellectual content. All right, so as I finish, I just want to take you back to my website for 1 second. I've raised a lot of problems, and I haven't really solved anything. Right? It was supposed to be this three little pigs, and at the end they're supposed to be like the perfect house or perfect temperature of oatmeal. I haven't really solved anything. We all know that this is a huge issue, that so many of those steep steps and those really crappy ramps, they exist on our campuses, they exist in our information architecture, they exist in our libraries and access to information. So here are a few things we can do just to start. There's a link here to the book, Academic Ableism, and it's open access. It's also developed according to the guidelines for building accessible books. And you can find a link to an article about those guidelines here. The other thing I urge you all, and I'm sure most of you have seen, is the ethical framework for library publishing that looks at guidelines for accessibility. The other thing is that if you all are involved in teaching in any way, or you can create some change on your campuses around teaching, there is a list of hundreds of universally designed teaching activities that's an appendix to the book and is open access and accessible. So if you're in a teaching situation, this is a place to go and just try one thing. It's like a gateway drug, right? If you try one, I don't know which gateway drug, but it's one of them. The idea is, don't let these accommodations just sit there. And don't assume that this is something that you would only do if you knew you had a disabled student in the room. You should assume all the time that disability is present. You should assume all the time that the things that we would do to accommodate that will help students in ways that you may not foresee, just like the digital curb cut effect. All right? The AODA Alliance, if you're somebody who's passionate about this, especially in terms of advocating for there being real teeth to the AODA, that's a group I really urge you to join, or at least to join their mailing list, because it gives opportunities to get involved. I think it's kind of a personal focus of mine, but I always think in this room as well, we need to think about disability and ourselves. There's a couple of guidelines here for there's a qualitative study about how faculty and staff get forced to disclose disability on campus, right, and what that process is like. This article, It Shouldn't Be So Hard, is on the hiring process for faculty and staff with disabilities. This is about faculty members' accommodation and access, wanted disabled faculty members. All of these things are oriented around thinking as well about if we're in the position to be hiring, we're in the position to be advocating for our colleagues or for ourselves for the accommodations that we need to understand that we're part of this steep steps process as well. And finally, this Composing Access project, it's a really excellent website that gives all these different suggestions about how when you create presentations or go to conferences like this, the different ways that you can make that more accessible. So I did say we'd have some time to ask questions on the note cards. If there are note card questions, you can ask them now and we'll pass them up, or maybe we can have people collect them. But we've got lots of time for questions, and I'd love to answer them, or try to. Athel, yeah?
Hi, Jay.
Hi. Thank you.
We've done some survey work with faculty and staff around document accessibility issues. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And I was just saying that we've done some survey work around with faculty and staff around document accessibility issues, and we find that maybe of the objections that are put in front of it, 10% is maybe attitudinal, 20% is just a lack of knowledge of how these things are creating barriers. But there is a big piece about people saying, or faculty saying, that they don't have time to learn how to do the strategies or the new workflows we're asking them to do. And in some ways, it's a legitimate thing, because as you know, admin staff in the university setting has been pared back tremendously.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, how would you address that with
Sure.
your colleagues?
Well, I think that it's a shared responsibility. I think it should be part of the educational fabric as well. I think it's ridiculous that we can have these so many. Well, it's part of the issue with disability, right? There are all these, on university campuses, there are all these ways disability gets studied as a thing to cure or eradicate or get rid of, right? There's very little engagement or study with disability as an identity or with disability as an advocacy or rights issue. And that's part of why we have a situation where we have all of these documents and websites that are inaccessible, and yet we have all of these students who need to learn how to make things accessible as a key part of what they should be getting from the university, and those two things don't meet, right? So it takes resources. But on my own campus, we have a huge initiative around knowledge translation. So you can get an RA for that person to help you translate your knowledge. What that really means is it's somebody who can help you build a website for your research or have a social media presence for your research. But if I want to get one of those RAs, I can just apply through the Dean of Arts research office. Lots of universities have programs like that, and they're willing to put the resources into that. And it is valuable for those students to be involved in that. I think it's a really terrifically valuable thing. It's worth every penny. But it would similarly be worth every penny for a researcher or for pedagogical reasons to be able to get a small grant or an RA-ship to make their information accessible. And that would be a really tangible value for the student who's involved as well. That's what I think, right? I also think university, the interesting thing for me is that, it's not interesting, it's sad. What we do for the majority of students is seen as an investment, and what we do for disabled students is seen as a drain. That's the big rhetorical problem. And I think we need to start framing this around a huge, the real drain, the real waste is the fact that up to 20% of students have disabilities and that we are losing them left and right. That is a huge loss to the intellectual potential of our country. It's never framed as such. It's framed as a natural thing, and they probably shouldn't be there anyway. It's framed as steep steps sorting the society in a reliable way. And it's simply not what's happening. We are losing a huge number of people who have a lot to say, a huge value to our society and our culture. And when you look at that as the cost, the loss of those people and that potential, then it doesn't look like very much to have an institutional contract with somebody who's going to make all PDFs and all websites accessible. That is a small investment. One other thing, it's a long answer, but I cannot not order a textbook. If I try to not have a textbook, I get phone calls and emails from the bookstore like mad. Right? Because they have money to make. It's difficult for me to prove to them I don't want a textbook. It's even more difficult for me to say to them, please, I only want the old edition because it should only be used copies. Right? Why is nobody checking with me before my syllabus is finished? Why is the only thing they're checking with me before my syllabus is finished is which textbook is going to be in the bookstore? Why is there not the same amount of effort to say, what other materials are you creating and have you planned for them to be accessible from the beginning? it becomes an easy and reasonable excuse for somebody to say, I don't have the time to do this. But what they really mean is, I did not plan for this class properly. That's why students are getting accessible resources in week 11 of a 12-week class. Because classes are not being universally designed. It could be the simple start, the gateway drug to that is just what I do on my campus. I just get on social media around that time when every single person I know is working on their syllabus. And I say, how are you planning your syllabus? Right? Here are some guidelines for making sure that what you're going to use is accessible. Right? If that gets built into the planning process over and over again, it's easy. You make sure that you choose screen readable PDFs instead of the old version you still have in a folder from 1997. It's not hard. You just have to plan that way. But we have, I don't know if the bookstore is a good example or not, but they badger me like heck to make sure I buy a book. Nobody's badgering me to check whether I have accessible PDFs, for example, within my course. Right? And it's not that, we pay all this money to content management systems. Huge amount of money, right? And nobody cares. I know, I go into Desire to Learn. They ask me to come there. They give me an Amazon card to spend 2 hours and do their, little group breakouts where they're competing with one another about some feature that they're going to develop. And every time I bring up accessibility, it's not part of the discussion, right? And this is a Waterloo-based company that could be doing a lot better. I think the same could be said for Blackboard and other companies, right? We pay them a huge amount of money, and they could be a lot better, right? There's a lot of things that they could build in that would make that process easier. That was a really long answer. But you know what? That's, in a way, I know that question is why a lot of you are here. Other questions? Yeah.
In the current political environment in Ontario, in the current, In the current political environment in Ontario, my concern is that the AODA will be completely watered down, and then how do we make the case to, not necessarily in our case library and administration, but university administration, that this is still important, this is still worth investing the money, and universal design for building and teaching UDL and stuff like that. So yeah.
Well, I think a couple things. One is now is actually a really crucial time. There's a key consultation that's happening right now. There's a report being written, and I'm going to not be able to name the people who are involved, but the provincial government has asked for a report. It's being worked on right now. Join the AODA Alliance mailing list. They'll give you a template for a letter you can send, you can edit and add to, and say, I am X and I work in this field and this really impacts my job on a day-to-day basis, and these are the things that I believe really need to happen for the AODA to be effective as a legislation at all, right? So now is a crucial time. The other piece for me is we need all these levers that are outside of just the law, right? And one of the key levers on a university campus is shame. And I strongly believe in the power of it. So on my own campus, when it snows like this, myself and other colleagues go around and we take pictures of the ramps that haven't been shoveled, and we tag plant ops and we put them on Twitter. It's kind of an a-hole move, maybe. It's the only way to get them done, right? We have an event and the space itself is accessible, but the parking is across campus and the washroom that's accessible is across campus. We shame them. They fix the washroom, and they do it in a week. So that's pretty powerful. And thinking about especially some of the high upper admin, those folks are really susceptible to that shame perspective, right? So I think that's useful. It's what David Lepofsky is doing in that slide that I showed, which is a simple agnostic thing of walking through the space, right? But in doing so, revealing the intentions of the space. And that shame, those videos, there's a few different versions of them, short ones and long ones. That was covered in the Star. That's had a lot of views. And Ryerson will think twice, right? I don't think they're going to fix that space, but they'll think twice before they do it again. And on the flip side, when you create a truly accessible space, I'd like to see that celebrated. You know, that's part of the issue too, right? If you can access some funding to make things accessible and then have a big unveiling, that's really valuable as well. And if there are any anonymous questions, let's pass them up. Or just note card questions.
So I'm at Ryerson.
Yeah.
And I don't know when we're ever going to address that. But I am on the UDL committee. And it's me from the library and another coworker from the Learning and Teaching office. And we go on a road show and we get young faculty, TAs, and that's about it.
Yeah.
And they believe in the philosophy, they can understand it, right? But we're preaching to a small sector.
Yeah.
But we're also aware that the Ontario Human Rights released a new report where they kind of say that UDL will be mandatory, you know, in a way.
Yeah.
And do you think that that might give it some teeth? Like maybe a student will bring it to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal if a professor does not practice UDL?
It's possible. I mean, the OHRC has been very powerful. It's made some huge changes. So for instance, there was a master's student at York who came through the Human Rights Commission with a complaint saying that students shouldn't be compelled to name an actual diagnosis. Well, that's changed what Offices of Disability Services do everywhere in Ontario, and it happened like that. That's huge. In the States, that's not the case, right? Or lots of places, that's not the case. So protecting that right to say, I'm not naming this diagnosis, has shown that that commission is a real lever for change. So I do think that will be another avenue, is those kinds of complaints, but it's unclear to me what is really meant by universal design. The kind of checklistification of universal design is problematic. It assumes that there are never conflicts of access. It assumes that the labor of access is this transparent thing. And it can be, well, anything that gets turned into a checklist can become really narrow. That said, it's better than nothing. It's much better than nothing. But I also worry a little bit because I've been on those UDL committees. And they really appeal to administrators because it looks like the way to not invest at all. It looks like the free way to have accessibility. And it downloads that labor onto we know, for instance, 50% of classes at Ontario colleges and universities are taught by people with no benefits and no job security. Are those people, 50% of the classes, going to be made accessible by people who have very little institutional power? That seems to me to be an unethical downloading of labor. So I don't know. I mean, but I think the gateway drug version of it, or the evangelical version of it, like you said, is powerful. For instance, again, this is a soapbox issue for me, but why, when I have an interface with the Office of Accessibility Services to say this student is going to need an alternative format or this student is going to need extended time on testing, why do I only get the legal minimum? Why don't I get some other suggestions too? It's an opportunity to interface with somebody. To say, beyond this range of mandated accommodations, here are other things you can consider in designing this course and in designing future courses. Because I think lots of instructors would like to know. It's about education sometimes. I worked really hard when I was in West Virginia to have just exactly that done. I had a 4,000 student writing program I administered that had no tests and exams and no lectures. So we went to the Office of Disability Services and we said, let's come up with a different range of accommodations. Because again, if for those 4,000 students that was the only thing, it wasn't helping anybody. So we came up with a range of accommodations for peer review, for collaborative work, for all these other things. And then we had a list. It was called an addendum. It was a letter that came along with that accommodation letter for every single student that said, here's a range of other things you can do that will help all of your students. So having a little extra push on that evangelical thing, right? Just like having, I don't know, the Bible in every hotel room. Like, have some more of those suggestions and ways to circulate them. And you said, you know, it's true. Most of the time, the people who come to these things already know, right? The people who you really want to reach and give a shake, they don't come. But lots of times, those people who do come, they are like horrible term, but they're like thought leaders, right? They're influencers. So extending, for instance, having some video examples of things that they do that are universally designed in their classroom and sharing those, then you're more likely to get some uptake from other people. Having more than just a checklist, right? That composing access project, that's what that was entailed. Instead of just saying, have alternative formats of your talk when you give it at a conference, it's a short video that's transcribed and accessible, but that says all the reasons why you would do it, that addresses all the counter arguments that people already have. So it's just a little bit more than saying, do this. It's giving examples of what the benefits are, and even sometimes addressing head-on the resistance. That doesn't really answer I don't know how to answer your question, right? And that's the point. Yeah. That's the work we have to do.
Hi, Jay. I just have another question.
Sure.
It's from our online
Great.
live stream.
Yeah.
Thoughts on precarious employees? As mentioned, the most likely to help to promote or support this without endangering their livelihood, especially those of us who have a disability ourselves, who incidentally have to hide it to be employed.
Yeah. So, and that's another advocacy point, is just at Ontario colleges and universities right now, it is very uneven. The process for faculty and employees to seek accommodations is a human rights complaint waiting to happen. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen. At my own university, to get an accommodation, I need to go and talk to my chair. That's unacceptable. That's why nobody's seeking an accommodation. If you have to talk to a chair or a dean, that person determines whether you get tenure. That person determines promotion, determines your performance review every year, determines your teaching schedule. They should have no access to this process. They're the ones who are most resistant to it changing because they feel like they want to be patted on the back for being good people. And this would acknowledge that they, in some cases, aren't. So there needs to be a central fund that doesn't come out of a department budget or a faculty budget for accommodations, and there needs to be an anonymous and protected way for people to seek those accommodations. Otherwise, people just won't get them, especially precarious folks. Some universities have a good system in place, but most don't. So anything you can do on your own campus to advocate for that practice, I think, is really important. I'm in the middle of we are on the delay cycle at Waterloo in terms of getting this done. They keep pushing it back. But that's what I would say. And I think if faculty themselves were protected, then those people could do the work that they are already doing much better. Okay.
Thank you, Jay, so much.
Thank you all. Yeah. If you have other questions, come see me. I'll be around, and maybe through the online portal as well. If there are questions that come out of this, I can have a look and find a way to respond that way. Thank you.